He had survived firefights in 3 countries, watched good men die in the dark, and carried the weight of decisions no human being should ever have to make. And none of it, not a single moment of it, had broken him the way one tiny voice did on a Tuesday afternoon in a park outside Seattle. "Daddy," Sophie said, tugging his sleeve with her whole 3-year-old body, "is she going to be my mommy?" Mason Reed didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the woman standing 10 feet away, Avery Sinclair, billionaire, CEO, the kind of person whose name appeared on the covers of magazines he'd never once bought, had just heard every word, and she wasn't walking away. She was crying. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been with us before, you already know we don't do ordinary stories on this channel. We tell the ones that stay with you, the ones that make you pull over on the side of the road because you can't see through the tears. If that sounds like your kind of thing, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. And before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell us what city and country you're watching from. We genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, like this video, settle in, and let's begin. The babysitter's name was Carol, and she had never once canceled in 14 months. Until the night before the date, Mason Reed had already agreed to go on, the date he'd spent the past 2 weeks trying to talk himself out of. The date his best friend had essentially engineered through a combination of guilt, persistence, and one very well-timed bottle of whiskey. Mason found out at 6:47 in the morning when his phone buzzed on the nightstand and Carol's name lit up the screen. He lay there for a second, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom he still hadn't finished painting. There was a strip of bare drywall near the window he kept meaning to get to. And then he picked up. "Mason, I am so sorry," Carol said immediately, and he could tell from her voice that she meant it. "My sister fell last night, hip. She's at the hospital and I need to be there. I'm so sorry. I know you have plans tonight." "Don't apologize," he said. "Go be with your sister. Sophie and I are fine." He meant it. He wasn't even particularly disappointed. If anything, some tight, knotted part of his chest loosened a little with the relief of a legitimate excuse. He lay there another minute after hanging up. Through the wall, he could hear Sophie starting to wake up, the small shuffling sounds, the creak of the toddler bed, the little half-formed murmur that always came before the full announcement of her presence. She was not a quiet waker. She never had been, even as an infant. He got up. Her name was Sophie Claire Reed, and she was 3 years and 4 months old, and she was the most terrifying thing Mason had ever loved. He'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan and one in a country he still couldn't talk about in any official capacity. He'd breached buildings in the dark with a rifle and a heartbeat, and the particular kind of calm that either comes naturally or kills you. He had, on 4 separate occasions, been in situations where the margin between alive and not was thin enough to see through. None of that had prepared him for the specific horror of loving something this small and this fragile and this completely dependent on him not to get it wrong. Sophie appeared in the doorway of his bedroom with her hair doing 3 different things at once, and her stuffed rabbit, a battered gray thing named Bun Boon that had survived more laundry cycles than he could count, dangling from her left hand by one ear. "Daddy," she said, in the tone of someone making a formal announcement, "I'm hungry." "Good morning to you too, kid." "Good morning." She patted across the floor and held up her arms. He picked her up and she immediately dropped her head on his shoulder with the total trust of someone who had never once in her life worried about being dropped. That trust was the heaviest thing he'd ever carried. He called his friend Daniel at 8:30, while Sophie sat at the kitchen table eating toast with an amount of strawberry jam that would have concerned a dentist. Daniel picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake and probably already at his desk, which tracked because Daniel Cho was the kind of person who voluntarily woke up at 6 a.m. and felt good about it. "Carol canceled," Mason said. A pause. "How?" "Her sister's in the hospital." "Okay, but I'm not taking Sophie to a restaurant, Daniel." "I wasn't going to say that." Another pause. "I was going to say maybe text Avery and explain and see if she wants to reschedule." Mason looked at Sophie, who had gotten jam on her cheek and was investigating it with one finger. "Or I just call it off and we both move on with our lives." "Mason, I'm serious. I don't know why I agreed to this in the first place. I'm not—" He stopped. Through the kitchen window, he could see the backyard, The small square of grass with the plastic slide he'd assembled badly last spring. One side listed slightly to the left. He'd kept meaning to fix it. I'm not in a place for this. You've been saying that for 2 years. Maybe it's been true for 2 years. Maybe, Daniel said. Or maybe you've just gotten very comfortable being miserable. Mason didn't say anything. Text her, Daniel said. Tell her what happened. You might be surprised. He didn't text her right away. He let Sophie finish breakfast, wiped the jam off her face over her very vocal objections, and put on a second pot of coffee because the first one hadn't done anything. He thought about Daniel's words with the part of his brain that was always assessing, always calculating odds and angles, and he kept arriving at the same conclusion. This was a reasonable opportunity to exit gracefully. He'd met Avery Sinclair exactly once, at a dinner party at Daniel's place 2 months ago, and it had lasted about 9 minutes. She'd been polite and sharp, and carefully composed in the way of someone who had learned to be that way in public. They talked about nothing important. He thought she was beautiful in a distant, abstract way, the way you might think a building was beautiful. You could acknowledge it without expecting to ever go inside. Then Daniel had done what Daniel did, and now Mason had her number saved in his phone under Avery, Daniel's thing, like a coward. He typed the text standing at the kitchen counter while Sophie went to retrieve Bun Bun from somewhere in the living room. Hey, Mason Reed, something came up with my babysitter. Family emergency on her end. I need to cancel tonight. Sorry for the short notice. He read it twice. It was fine. It was a perfectly reasonable text. He hit send. Her response came back in 4 minutes. Is your daughter okay? He stared at that for a second. She's fine. Her regular sitter had to deal with her own family situation. Oh, I misread. I thought you said Sophie was the emergency. Glad she's okay. A pause, and then, actually, what if we don't cancel? Bring her. We could do something outside. Is there a park she likes? Mason read that 3 times. He walked to the doorway and looked at Sophie, who had found Bun Bun and was now sitting on the living room floor, explaining something to him in a very serious voice. She did this often. He'd never figured out what they were discussing. He typed back, You don't have to do that. I know. I want to. I like parks. He stood there long enough that Sophie noticed him and looked up. Daddy, you okay? Yeah, Bug. He looked at the phone. What do you think about going to Riverside Park today? Sophie's face broke open. The one with the ducks? The one with the ducks. She launched herself off the floor with Bun Bun clasped to her chest. Yes. Mason looked at the phone again and typed Riverside Park, 2 p.m., and hit send before he could think about it any longer. He changed his shirt twice, which he was mildly disgusted with himself about. The first one was a button-down he'd worn to a meeting with his accountant last March, and it looked wrong, too deliberate. The second was a flannel he'd grabbed without thinking and then put back when he noticed a small handprint on the left shoulder. Strawberry jam, almost certainly from this morning. He ended up in a gray t-shirt and jeans and his Old Navy baseball cap, because at some point a person had to stop being performative about it. Sophie, for her part, had very strong opinions about her outfit. She wanted the dress with the sunflowers, the yellow rain boots because they're happy, Daddy, and her backpack with the cartoon fox on it because apparently Bun Bun needed the backpack and Bun Bun was attending. Mason didn't negotiate on the backpack. Some battles weren't worth it. They left at 1:20. In the car, Sophie talked continuously about the ducks, about Bun Bun's previous experience with ducks, about whether ducks could understand what Bun Bun said to them, and about what she would name a duck if she got to. Mason answered on autopilot, one hand on the wheel, the other part of his attention doing the low-level thing it always did, scanning, processing, looking for variables. He didn't know what he was nervous about. That was the part that bothered him. Mason Reed had spent years operating in situations where there was a clear threat and a clear mission, and the nervousness, when it showed up at all, had something concrete to attach itself to. This was different. This was just a woman at a park. He didn't like it. He spotted her before she saw him. She was standing near the park entrance in dark jeans and a simple blue blouse, her dark hair down, no heels, no visible entourage. He'd read enough about Avery Sinclair in the past 2 months. Daniel had sent him a couple of articles, which he'd read once and then refused to admit he'd read, To know that she was almost never photographed without being put together in a very specific, controlled way. The woman at the entrance looked like a person. Just a person. She was looking at her phone, and there was something tight in her posture that he recognized. She was nervous too. That made him feel, unexpectedly, a little better.
"Daddy, is that the lady?" Sophie said from beside him, holding his hand. "Yeah, Bug, that's Avery." "She's pretty." "Yeah." He started walking. "Be polite, okay? You don't have to talk if you don't want to." Sophie, who had never once in her life chosen not to talk, gave him a look that suggested she understood this note, but was reserving the right to ignore it. Avery saw them when they were about 20 feet away. Something shifted in her expression. He watched it happen, the small recalibration, and then she put her phone in her pocket and came forward. "Hi," she said. To him first, then her eyes went immediately to Sophie. Her voice dropped a register, went softer without becoming performative about it. "And you must be Sophie. I've heard great things." Sophie regarded her. This was the evaluative phase. He'd seen it with other adults, the 6 to 10 second assessment where Sophie decided whether someone was worth her trust. Most people got uncomfortable under it and started talking too fast. Avery didn't. She just waited. "I have rain boots," Sophie finally said. "I can see that."
Avery crouched down, which he hadn't expected, and looked at them seriously.
"Those are excellent boots. They're happy boots." "I believe you. I could use a pair of those."
She glanced up at Mason for just a second, and he caught something in her expression he couldn't quite name. Then she straightened. "Should we find the ducks?" Sophie grabbed Mason's hand and looked at Avery. "You can come too," she said, as if she were conferring an honor. The corner of Avery's mouth pulled up. "Thank you." The ducks, when located, were near the small pond on the east side of the park. Sophie approached them with the controlled intensity of a professional, crouching at the bank and offering a piece of bread she'd been clutching in her coat pocket for 20 minutes. Mason and Avery stood back a few feet, giving her room, giving each other room, maybe, without having explicitly agreed to it. "So," she said. Not awkward, just opening a door. "So," he said, "Daniel told me you were in the Navy. He told me you ran a tech company. Did he make it sound bigger than it is?" "He said it was the size of a small country." She laughed. Real, not performed. "That's about right, although small country implies someone's in charge. Most days it just feels like organized chaos with better Wi-Fi." He looked at her. "Most days?" "Fine. All days." She watched Sophie redirect her bread offering toward a particularly bold duck. "She's wonderful. She's something." He said it without irony. "Today she told me that clouds were the sky's way of thinking out loud." Avery turned to look at him. "That's genuinely beautiful." "I know. She's 3. It's unsettling." She laughed again, and this time she didn't pull it back as quickly. He noticed things without meaning to. Old habit, occupation-specific, a kind of reading that had kept him alive on 3 continents and was now being used to observe that Avery Sinclair had a small scar near her left temple, that she tugged at the hem of her blouse when she was thinking, and that she positioned herself slightly angled away from the open park behind them, like someone who was used to watching her own back. He recognized that. "You didn't want to come today," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him. "What?" "When I texted. The response time. 4 minutes on a text from someone you're supposed to be meeting for a first date. That's someone deciding whether to keep the exit open." A pause. "You timed my response?" "I noticed things. Habit." She looked at him for a moment, and he wasn't sure if she was annoyed or something else. "No," she said finally. "I didn't want to come. I'd already almost canceled 3 times." "What changed your mind?" "You told me your babysitter had a family emergency and you were going to cancel." She looked back at Sophie. "And that's a completely reasonable thing. Most people would have just said, 'Sorry, something came up. Let's reschedule.' And I would have said, 'Fine,' and we would have sent 2 more texts and then quietly stopped responding." She paused. "But you sounded like someone who genuinely didn't want to inconvenience me, not someone playing a game." "I wasn't playing a game." "I know. That's the thing." She glanced at him sideways. "That's why I said bring her." He didn't say anything for a second. Sophie had abandoned the bread and was now attempting to have a conversation with a duck that was mostly ignoring her but had not, to her credit, left either. For what it's worth, Mason said, I wasn't sure I wanted to come either. What changed your mind? He looked at Sophie. She really likes ducks. Avery laughed, genuinely, and this time the tightness he'd noticed in her posture when he first saw her by the entrance was gone. They walked the main path for a while after the ducks lost interest in Sophie's bread offerings and dispersed into the pond with a magnificent indifference. Sophie walked between them, sometimes holding Mason's hand, sometimes bolting ahead to investigate a stick or a pine cone, or an apparently very interesting crack in the pavement. Mason and Avery talked. It wasn't careful conversation, the kind where you're monitoring what you say. It was the other kind, where something loosens and you stop curating and just talk. He told her about leaving the Navy, not the operational parts, just the leaving. The strange vertigo of re-entry, the civilian world that felt like a language he'd once known and now only half remembered. She told him about building the company from a two-person operation in a rented room in Portland, the early years when failure was a weekly possibility, and she'd slept on a coworker's couch for 8 months because she couldn't justify the rent. Daniel made it sound like you came out of nowhere, Mason said, like you showed up already successful. Daniel has a talent for narrative simplification. She navigated around a crack in the path. It took 11 years. Most of them were pretty ugly. What kept you going? She thought about it. Stubbornness, mostly, and the specific kind of spite that comes from people telling you that you can't do something. People told you that? Constantly. No heat in it, just a fact. You'd be surprised what people think they're entitled to say to a woman asking for money to build something. He didn't have a response to that wouldn't be either insufficient or patronizing, so he didn't offer one. She didn't seem to need him to. They were passing a bench near the north path when Mason saw the man. I was old, mid-70s at least, in a weathered jacket, moving slowly with 2 large reusable bags that were clearly heavier than was comfortable. He stopped every few steps and repositioned his grip. Nobody around him was paying any attention. Mason had already changed course before he'd consciously decided to. "Give me 1 second," he said to Avery, and went. The man's name was Walt. Mason found that out while carrying both bags, which turned out to contain, among other things, 4 cans of soup, 2 bags of rice, a watermelon that Walt admitted he had not fully thought through at the store, and a truly impressive quantity of canned corn. "You don't have to do this," Walt said, for the second time, in the tone of someone who was relieved someone was doing it. "It's fine. You nearby?" "Greenview Apartment." "That building right there, actually." He pointed. "3rd floor. The elevator works about 60% of the time. Let's hope this is the 60%. It was. Mason got the bags upstairs, declined Walt's offer of lemonade, got back to the park in under 10 minutes. Sophie and Avery were sitting on a bench, Sophie mid-explanation of something that required extensive hand gestures. Avery was listening with real attention, not the performance of attention, actual, present attention. He stood there for a second before they saw him. He hadn't meant to stop. He told himself later that he was just catching his breath. Avery looked up. That was fast. 3rd floor, elevator worked. He sat down on the other side of Sophie. "What are we talking about?" "Bun, Sophie said. "I was telling Avery about when Bun got sick." "Bun got lost in Target for 20 minutes, Mason told Avery. "It was a medical emergency." "It was very scary," Sophie confirmed, nodding gravely. Avery looked at Mason. Something had shifted slightly in her expression, something he couldn't read exactly, but it was there. He looked away first. They stayed at the park until the light started going amber and sideways, and Sophie, who had been running on duck excitement and park energy and the specific fuel of 3-year-olds, finally began to wind down into the particular heavy-lidded state that meant she had approximately 45 minutes before full crash. Mason started packing up Sophie's backpack, the crackers, the juice box she hadn't finished, Bun's travel situation. Avery handed him the small blanket that had migrated under the bench. "Thank you for today," she said. She meant it. He could tell the difference. "You're the one who said to bring her." "I'm glad I did." She looked at Sophie, who was investigating something on the ground near the path. I know people say things like this, and it's usually polite conversation. She's actually great, Mason said. You don't have to qualify it. Avery met his eyes. She's actually great. Yeah, he said it simply. I know. He picked Sophie up, settling her against his shoulder, and she went heavy-limbed the way she did when she was close to sleep, her head dropping sideways, Bun clutched against her chest. Avery was gathering her own bag when Sophie suddenly stirred. She turned her head toward Avery, one small hand extended. Avery leaned in, expecting. A wave, maybe. A hug. Something communicable from a tired 3-year-old. Sophie's hand found her cheek. The touch was so light it barely registered physically. But then Sophie smiled, the real one, the one that took over her whole face, and she whispered one single word. Mommy. Mason felt it go through him like something physical, like a frequency. He opened his mouth immediately. Soph, hey. She's not. It's okay. Avery's voice was very quiet. He looked at her. Her eyes were bright with something she wasn't trying to hide, and she wasn't stepping back, wasn't recoiling, wasn't doing any of the things he'd braced for. She leaned in a little closer to Sophie and said gently, I'm not your mommy, sweetheart, but thank you. Thank you for that. Sophie, satisfied with whatever exchange had occurred, put her head back down on Mason's shoulder and closed her eyes. The three of them stood there in the fading afternoon light. Mason didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure there was anything adequate. Avery straightened up. She pressed her lips together once, briefly. Then she said, in a voice that was steady but barely, She's incredible, Mason. He looked at his daughter, then back at the woman standing in front of him, who had just had something said to her that she hadn't expected and hadn't run from it, who had knelt down in a park and produced a bottle of bubbles, who had sat on a bench and listened to the story of Bun Bun's Target incident with genuine attention. I know, he said again. His voice was rougher than he intended. I know she is. Avery nodded once. She pulled the strap of her bag up onto her shoulder. I should let you get her home. A pause. I had a good day, in case that wasn't obvious. It wasn't obvious, he said. But I'm glad you said it. She smiled, small but real. Then she turned and walked toward the parking area, and he stood there with his daughter sleeping against his shoulder and watched her go until she turned the corner. He drove home with Sophie breathing deep and steady in the back seat, Bun tucked under her arm, the gray rabbit's single remaining eye staring up at the ceiling of the car. The dashboard lights were low. The radio was off. He had spent the morning certain he wanted out of this. He drove home thinking about her voice when she'd said, "Thank you for trusting me." The way she'd said it, not to him, to a 3-year-old. When there was nothing to gain from it, when no one important was watching. He merged onto the highway and kept his eyes on the road. He didn't know what any of it meant yet, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't completely certain he wanted to stop finding out. He didn't call her. That was the first thing. He drove home with Sophie asleep in the back seat, put her to bed still in her sunflower dress because he wasn't willing to risk waking her up over a wardrobe change. And then he sat at the kitchen table for a while with a glass of water he didn't drink and thought about how he wasn't going to call her. He wasn't going to text either. He was going to let it be what it was. A good afternoon, an unexpected one, the kind of thing that happens sometimes and means nothing except that occasionally the world surprises you and then goes back to normal. That was the reasonable position. He'd held reasonable positions under considerably more pressure than this. He lasted 2 days. Not even 2 full days. It was Tuesday night when he got home, and by Thursday morning he was standing in his kitchen while Sophie ate cereal, and he was looking at his phone with the specific kind of self-awareness that arrives when you've already decided to do something, but you're still pretending you haven't. He typed, "Sophie keeps asking about the duck lady. I told her your name, but she's decided duck lady is better." He sent it before he could edit it into something more controlled. Her response came back in under a minute this time. Duck lady is honestly a significant upgrade from most of my titles. Tell her I said hi. He showed Sophie the text. Sophie's face went incandescent. She knows who I am, Sophie said, as if this were a matter of some celebrity. She does. Can she come see the ducks again? Maybe, he said, which in parent language meant he was going to make that happen and just hadn't worked out the details yet. The second time they met was not romantic in any conventional sense of the word. Avery had suggested a Saturday morning, and Mason had agreed, and then Sophie had a stomach thing on Friday night that kept them both up until 2 a.m. and left her wan and clingy and deeply uninterested in ducks by Saturday morning. Mason texted Avery at 7 to say they might need to postpone, and Avery replied, "Does she need anything? I can bring stuff."
He'd stared at that for a moment. What kind of stuff? Ginger ale, crackers, those little Pedialyte popsicles, if she'll take them. My sister used to get sick constantly when she was little. I became an expert. He hadn't known she had a sister. He realized he didn't know much about her at all, which was a strange thing to recognize about someone you'd spent an entire afternoon with. "You don't have to do that," he typed. Mason. Just that, his name, the way someone says it when they're done with the argument. She arrived at 9:15 with a paper bag from the pharmacy and another one from a grocery store, and Sophie was on the couch under a blanket watching a cartoon about a small pig, and Avery came in and sat on the floor next to the couch. On the floor, not the armchair, not the other end of the couch, and said, "Hi, Bug. I heard you had a rough night." Sophie looked at her with fever-glassy eyes and said, "My tummy was mean to me." "Your tummy was really rude, Wes," Avery agreed seriously. "We're going to have a talk with it." She pulled a box of popsicles from the bag. "Orange or grape?" Sophie considered this with the gravity of someone making a binding legal decision. "Orange." "Excellent choice." Mason stood in the doorway of the living room and watched Avery Sinclair, who was reportedly worth somewhere in the range of $800 million, and whose face had appeared on the cover of 4 national business publications in the past 3 years, sitting cross-legged on his living room floor, helping his sick daughter open a popsicle wrapper, and he didn't know what to do with that information. So he went and made coffee and brought her a cup and sat down on the couch near Sophie's feet, and the 3 of them watched the pig cartoon together, and nobody said anything for a while, and it was somehow one of the least awkward silences he'd been in years. Sophie fell back asleep around 10 with the popsicle stick still loosely in her hand and Bun Bun pressed against her chin. Mason extracted the stick carefully, and he and Avery moved to the kitchen, lowering their voices without discussing it. "She's going to be fine," Avery said, wrapping both hands around her coffee mug. "Kids that age bounce back fast." "I know, it's still—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She looked at him. "Still hard to watch." "Yeah." "How long has it been? Since her mom?" He'd expected the question at some point. He'd thought about how he'd answer it, which version of the story to offer, and now that it was here, he found he didn't want to perform it. 18 months. Almost 19. She was in a car accident. He paused. Sophie doesn't really remember her. She was barely 2. Avery was quiet for a moment, not filling the silence with something uncomfortable, just letting it be. He appreciated that more than she probably knew. "Does she ask about her?" "Sometimes. She asked last month if mommies go away and come back, like the birds. We get migratory birds in the yard in spring." He looked at the coffee in his mug. "I told her that her mommy wasn't coming back, that she was somewhere she couldn't travel from, but that she'd loved Sophie as much as anybody ever loved anybody." The kitchen was quiet. "What did she say?" Avery asked. "She said okay and went back to her cereal." He shook his head slightly. 3-year-olds process things in 4 seconds and then want more orange juice. I stood there for 10 minutes trying to remember how to breathe." Avery looked at him with something he didn't want to examine too closely. "You're doing a good job with her, Mason." "Some days." He lifted his mug. "Other days I'm Googling is this rash normal at midnight and second-guessing every decision I've made since I got home." "That sounds about right," she said. "From what I understand, that's basically parenthood. You don't have kids." "No." A pause. Small, but there. "I didn't—" "No." It wasn't the right time, and then the right time kept not arriving. He looked at her. There was something behind that sentence that was longer than the sentence itself, but she wasn't offering more, and he wasn't going to reach for it. "Avery," he said. "Why'd you come over here today?" She met his eyes. "Because a little girl had a stomach thing and needed popsicles." She said it simply, like the answer was obvious, like there wasn't a version of it that required unpacking. But the thing was, he'd been around people who performed kindness. He'd seen it enough in the military, in the years after, the public gestures that were really a form of photography. What Avery had just done, showing up at 9 in the morning for a sick kid she'd met once, carrying a bag from a pharmacy, sitting on the floor. That wasn't performance. There was nobody watching. There was nothing to gain. She'd just done it. He didn't say any of that. He just nodded. "Okay," he said.
What happened next wasn't a decision so much as a series of small things that accumulated without either of them formally agreeing to them. She came to the park again the following weekend, and this time Sophie, fully recovered, operating at maximum wattage, brought Bun Bun and a detailed plan for the ducks that involved distributing bread in a very specific sequence she had developed and refined since their last visit. Avery followed the instructions precisely and without complaint. Sophie was pleased. Then there was the afternoon 3 weeks after that when Avery was finishing a call in her car in the parking lot of the coffee shop where they had agreed to meet, and Mason arrived with Sophie before Avery was done, and Sophie pressed her face against the car window until Avery noticed and laughed so hard she lost the thread of whatever she'd been saying to whoever was on the line. She wrapped up the call in 30 seconds and got out of the car, and Sophie grabbed her hand and said, come on, and pulled her toward the coffee shop door without waiting. And then there was the dinner at Mason's house. He'd made pasta, which was one of approximately 4 things he could cook reliably. And it wasn't anything special. Jarred sauce, chicken, the Parmesan from the green can that he knew you weren't supposed to use but always did anyway. He told her this when he invited her, warned her that he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. And she'd said, I've eaten gas station sushi in a conference room at midnight. Jarred sauce is fine. She'd brought wine and a small stuffed elephant for Sophie, which she'd produced almost shyly from her bag, uncertain, he could see it, whether it was overstepping. Sophie had christened the elephant Peanut with a solemnity that suggested the name had been divinely assigned, and Peanut was introduced to Bun Bun and a diplomatic relationship was established. They ate at the kitchen table with Sophie between them and the overhead light that Mason kept meaning to replace at half brightness because one of the bulbs was out, and it was ordinary in a way that Mason hadn't realized he'd been missing. Not exciting in any dramatic sense, just full. The table full, the noise level higher than he was used to, Sophie narrating things constantly, Avery asking follow-up questions about Bun Bun's preferences with complete sincerity. After Sophie was in bed, they sat on the back porch with the remains of the wine and the nighttime sounds of the neighborhood, and Avery said, Can I ask you something? You can ask. What made you leave the Navy? I mean, specifically. You don't have to answer that. He was quiet for a moment. The porch light had moths around it, the same moths every night, same relentless circles. Sophie needed someone consistent, someone who was actually there. He turned the wine glass in his hands. And my last deployment, something happened. I can't go into the operational specifics, but he stopped. I lost someone, one of my guys, and I had to make a call that I'm still not certain was the right one. And after that, I didn't trust myself the same way anymore. You need to trust yourself in that job. When that goes, you're a liability to the people around you. Avery didn't rush to fill that with reassurance. She sat with it. Do you miss it? She asked eventually. Parts of it. He looked out at the dark yard. I miss the clarity. Civilian life is complicated in different ways. Everything is longer and slower and less defined, and you can spend a year on a decision that would have taken 3 seconds in the field. He paused. I don't miss being afraid all the time. I didn't know I was afraid all the time until I wasn't anymore. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I know something about that. The long version. He looked at her. The company, she said. The first 4 or 5 years I was afraid every day. Not physically, but there was this constant low-level terror. That it was all going to collapse, that I'd made a mistake I couldn't recover from, that people were going to figure out I didn't know what I was doing. She took a small sip of wine. You build enough armor against that kind of fear, and eventually you can't feel much else either. Is that what the armor's for? He asked. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else. She turned to look at him directly. She had a way of doing that, of meeting a thing head-on instead of deflecting, that he'd noticed and filed. What does it look like from the outside? Like someone who's waiting for the thing that's wrong, he said. The angle, the ask. The reason someone's being nice. She held his gaze. Most of the time there is one. I know. But not always, she said quietly. No, he agreed. Not always. The moths kept circling. A dog barked somewhere 2 houses down and then stopped. I'm not good at this, she said. At what? She gestured vaguely. This. Whatever this is. I'm out of practice and I'm not easy to be around. I've been told that.
I work too much and I go quiet when I'm stressed and I cancel things at the last minute because something always needs my attention and I... She stopped. I'm listing my flaws at you at 9:30 on a Thursday.
That's a good sign. Avery. What? You came over on a Saturday morning with popsicles because my kid was sick. She looked at him. I'm not worried about your flaws, he said. She looked away first that time. Her jaw moved slightly, a swallow, something she was managing. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They sat there until the wine was gone. Well, it wasn't all easy, and he'd be lying if he pretended otherwise. There was a Sunday in late October when Avery canceled. Not the first time. She'd had to bail on 2 things before, always with a reason, always with an apology, always with a rescheduled plan. But this time she canceled an hour before they were supposed to meet, and Mason was already in the car, Sophie already strapped into her seat, already promised the zoo. The text said, something came up. Work. I'm so sorry. Can we do next week? He sat in the car for a minute. Sophie said, Daddy, are we going? He looked in the rearview mirror at her expectant face. Yeah, Bug, we're going. He took her to the zoo. He paid the entry fee and carried her on his shoulders through the reptile house and bought her the overpriced animal crackers she'd been angling for and did not check his phone once, because she deserved his full attention, and so that was what she got. But that night, after Sophie was in bed, he stood at the kitchen window and had an honest conversation with himself. He knew what cancellations like that could mean. He'd seen the pattern before in other contexts, the slow exit, the gradual withdrawal, the apologies that start sincere and curdle over time into avoidance. And he had more to protect now than his own feelings. Sophie had started asking about Avery by name, had included her in drawings she brought home from preschool, had explained to Bun Bun, in a conversation Mason overheard through the cracked bedroom door, that Avery was their friend. His daughter was 3 years old and she was already emotionally invested, and that was his fault. And he needed to be honest with himself about what he was doing. He almost didn't text. But then he thought about what he actually knew. Not what he was afraid of, but what he actually knew. And what he knew was that she'd sat on his living room floor and opened a popsicle wrapper. What he knew was that she'd listened to Sophie explain Bun Bun for 20 minutes with genuine attention. What he knew was that when he told her about his last deployment, about the decision he still wasn't sure had been right, she'd said nothing reassuring and instead had just stayed in the space of it with him, which was worth more than reassurance. He texted, Sophie was disappointed today. I just want you to know that. Not trying to make you feel bad, just being straight with you. 3 minutes passed. Then, I know, I'm so sorry, can I call you? He stepped out onto the back porch, and she called. I'm not making excuses, she said. She sounded different on the phone than in person. The boardroom layer more stripped back, or maybe that was just the hour. One of my investors is threatening to pull out of a deal that I've been working on for 8 months, and the call I couldn't miss was with our legal team, and it ran 2 hours, and She stopped. I know that's not Sophie's problem. It's not, he said. Not harshly, just honestly. I know. A pause. I don't know how to do this. The balancing. I've spent 12 years building something where I'm always available for the work because that's what you have to do in the early years, and now the early years are technically over, but the habit isn't. And She stopped again. I'm telling you this not as an excuse, just so you know it's not about you or her. It's me. It's genuinely just me. I figured that, he said. I still needed to tell you about Sophie. You should have. You were right to. Quiet for a moment. Is she okay? She had a good day. She saw a giraffe up close and almost lost her mind about it. A small exhale, something like a laugh. I missed a giraffe incident. A significant one. The giraffe was very tall. Sophie had opinions. Mason. Her voice shifted. I'll do better. I'm not asking for a promise, he said. I'm asking for honesty. If this isn't working for you, I'd rather know now. It's working for me, she said, and her voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it that didn't leave room for ambiguity. It's the part of my week I look forward to the most. That's actually slightly terrifying to say out loud. He leaned against the porch railing. The same dog 2 houses over made a sound, something between a bark and a complaint. Why terrifying? Because the things I've looked forward to the most have also been the things I've lost the fastest. She said it plainly, without drama, like she'd spent time getting to the point where she could say it that way. I'm not a fast learner on that particular lesson. He thought about what to say to that and decided the honest version was, me neither. The zoo trip happened the following Saturday. Avery was there at 9 when they arrived, already at the entrance with her hands in her jacket pockets and her hair pulled back. And when Sophie saw her, she dropped Mason's hand and ran. Avery dropped into a crouch and caught her, and Sophie's arms went around her neck, and Avery's eyes closed for just a second, just briefly, before she opened them and met Mason's gaze over Sophie's shoulder. He nodded once. She nodded back. They spent 4 hours at the zoo. The giraffe area warranted a second visit after Sophie deemed the first one insufficient. Avery discovered that Sophie had very specific opinions about which animals were polite and which were rude. Elephants were polite, peacocks were extremely rude, and took detailed notes on this taxonomy. Mason bought terrible coffee from a cart and drank all of it anyway, and watched Avery crouch beside his daughter at the glass of the butterfly enclosure and point at something he couldn't see from where he was standing, and Sophie's face went wide and astonished at whatever it was. There were moments during the day when he'd catch himself watching her and have to look away, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it was the opposite of uncomfortable in a way he hadn't been braced for. On the way to the parking lot, Sophie between them, holding one hand each, she said quietly to Mason, "Thank you for calling me on it." The cancellation. Yeah. She was looking ahead. I need people in my life who'll do that. I don't have many of them. I'll probably do it again, he said. Fair warning. She glanced at him sideways. I'm counting on it. Sophie tugged both their hands simultaneously in a move she'd clearly been planning. Swing me, she announced. Swing. They swung her, once, twice, her feet going off the pavement, her laugh rising up into the gray October afternoon. And Mason thought about what Avery had said. The things I've looked forward to the most have also been the things I've lost the fastest. And he thought, yeah, he knew about that. He knew exactly about that. But Sophie was still laughing, and Avery was laughing too, and the parking lot lights were coming on as the afternoon got dark, and he decided that some things were still worth the risk of losing them. The dinner at his place became a regular thing, then a weekly thing, then a thing that happened so naturally, neither of them noted when it had stopped being occasional. She learned that Sophie needed a 20-minute wind down before bed, and that skipping it was a gamble you almost always lost. She learned that Bun Bun had to be in the bed before Sophie would get into it. She learned that Mason drank his coffee black, but always bought the creamer anyway, because Sophie liked to watch it swirl. Mason learned that Avery had a tell when she was stressed. She stacked things, cups, coasters, small objects, unconsciously building and restacking them. He started leaving objects within reach when she came over after hard days at the company, which she only noticed when she laughed about it 6 weeks in, and he admitted he'd done it deliberately. You're strange, she told him. You keep coming back, he said. She didn't have a comeback for that, which he noted. Around them, something was building that neither of them had formally acknowledged. It wasn't convenient. She worked 60-hour weeks, and he had a 3-year-old whose schedule ran the household, and they were both people who'd been broken by things they didn't fully talk about yet. But it was real in the way that inconvenient things sometimes are. Exactly because it didn't fit into anything neat, exactly because no one had engineered it past that first date that almost didn't happen. He was learning her the way you learn something you intend to keep. Not in summaries or highlights, but in the details. The way she held a mug, the way she went quiet before she said something that mattered, the particular set of her shoulders when she walked into a room and was still deciding whether she trusted it. She was learning him back. He didn't always know what to do with that, but he was getting there. And Sophie, who had already decided weeks ago that this was all perfectly right and necessary and obvious, slept soundly in her room with Bun Bun and Peanut arranged on either side of her like 2 small sentinels, guarding something she hadn't needed to be taught to protect. The first time Mason kissed her, it wasn't planned, and it wasn't romantic in the way movies make it look. It was a Wednesday evening in November, and Sophie had finally gone down after 40 minutes of negotiation that had involved 3 separate requests for water, a debate about whether Peanut was cold and needed a second blanket, and a philosophical inquiry into why the dark was dark instead of some other color. Mason came out of the bedroom looking like a man who had survived a minor siege, and Avery was in the kitchen washing the dinner dishes because she'd started doing that without being asked sometime around week 4, and neither of them had commented on it. She heard him come in and said, without turning around, "How bad?" She asked me what stars are made of. What did you tell her? I told her they were made of fire and gas, and she said that sounded dangerous, and I told her they were very far away, and she said okay, and passed out mid-sentence. He sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on it. I need about 6 consecutive hours of not talking. That's fair. She turned off the water and reached for the dish towel. And he was standing up when she turned around and she nearly walked into him because the kitchen wasn't big, and he'd moved without announcing it, and she pulled up short, and they stood there about a foot apart with her holding a damp dish towel, and him looking at her with that particular look he got sometimes that he'd never actually explained. Mason, she said cautiously. Yeah, he said. And then he leaned forward and kissed her, and it was brief and slightly off-center because neither of them had positioned for it, and when he pulled back, she was still holding the dish towel. Okay, she said after a second. Okay? Okay, good. Not okay problem. She set the towel down on the counter. Just to clarify. Good to know, he said. She kissed him back, this time deliberate, and it was better for being planned by about 2 seconds. It didn't change everything overnight, because neither of them was built for overnight change. What it did was remove a particular kind of uncertainty that had been sitting between them for weeks. Not unpleasantly, but with the quiet pressure of a thing waiting to be resolved. Now it was resolved, and what was left was something that felt less like the beginning of a thing and more like the acknowledgement of something already in progress. She still went home to her apartment across the city most nights. He still had a 3-year-old who woke before 6 and required immediate engagement with the world. They still talked on the phone more than they saw each other because that was the practical reality of two people whose lives didn't naturally overlap in terms of schedule or geography. But the calls were different now. Longer, less careful. She'd call from her car driving home from the office at 9 p.m., and he'd pick up from the couch where he'd been reading, and they'd talk about nothing important for an hour, just her voice and his voice and the particular quiet of two people who'd decided they trusted each other enough not to perform. Daniel found out because Daniel always found out everything, and his response was a single text to Mason at 8 in the morning. I know. Then 20 minutes later, you're welcome. Mason didn't reply until noon. He sent back a thumbs up, which Daniel would correctly interpret as the maximum acknowledgement he was going to get. What Mason didn't tell Avery, not immediately, was that he'd seen things in the past few weeks that were making the part of his brain that never fully stood down start to take inventory. It started small. A black SUV parked across from his entrance to her building twice in 1 week. A man in a parking garage who'd been too interested in which direction she was walking. An email she'd mentioned in passing. Someone from her past sending messages through intermediaries. Messages that were framed as business communications, but had an edge under them that she'd explained away as the normal turbulence of the tech world. His brain had filed those things separately, and then, in the particular way of trained threat assessment, connected them without being asked to. Her name was Avery Sinclair. She was worth more than most people could meaningfully conceptualize. She operated in a world where information was currency and leverage was common, and most disputes resolved through lawyers and boardrooms. But Mason had spent 10 years in environments where those same power dynamics expressed themselves differently. Not in courtrooms, but in parking garages. Not in breach of contract filings, but in a particular kind of organized pressure meant to make someone afraid enough to comply. He knew what the setup looked like. He didn't say anything yet. He was watching. The preschool Christmas pageant was on a Thursday afternoon, and Avery had cleared her calendar for it 3 weeks in advance, which Mason knew because she'd mentioned it once, offhandedly, and he'd caught the deliberateness behind the casualness. She didn't want to make a production of the commitment. She just wanted to keep it. Sophie was playing a snowflake, which in the 4-year-old pageant hierarchy was apparently a coveted role. She'd been practicing her snowflake stance, arms out, rotating slowly, for the better part of 2 weeks. Bun Bun had been drafted as a practice audience. Avery arrived at the school in dark slacks and a simple sweater, no driver, no assistant, having come straight from a morning of meetings. She found Mason in the 3rd row saving her a seat with Sophie's Fox backpack, which she moved and sat down and handed back without comment. How nervous is she? Avery whispered. She threw up a little bit at breakfast. Oh no. She said it was from excitement, not fear, and there's a distinction that matters to her. Avery pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. She didn't entirely succeed. The pageant was 22 minutes long, which was about 18 minutes more than the material strictly required. But in the tradition of all preschool performances, it expanded to contain the maximum possible number of moments for parents to photograph. Sophie came on in the second segment with 4 other snowflakes, all of them in white tutus and silver headbands, and she immediately located Mason and Avery in the audience with the precision of a heat-seeking system and gave them a wave so enthusiastic it briefly compromised her snowflake stance. Mason waved back. Avery waved back. Sophie, satisfied, returned to rotating. Afterward, in the hallway, Sophie ran to them both with her tutu bunched in her fists and her headband slightly crooked, and she grabbed Avery's hand and Mason's hand at the same time and said, breathlessly, "Did you see me? I was the best snowflake." "You were definitely the best snowflake," Avery said. "I saw another kid wobble," Sophie said. "I didn't wobble." "You were exceptionally stable," Mason said, "for a snowflake." Sophie considered this adequate praise and announced she was hungry. They went to the diner 2 blocks from the school because Sophie had specifically requested the one with the big pancakes, even though it was 4 in the afternoon, and the 3 of them sat in a red vinyl booth, and Sophie got the pancakes and ate approximately a third of one and declared herself full, and Mason ate the rest standing up because that was how these things went. On the way to the car, Sophie was between them, holding both their hands, and she tried the swing move again, the one from the zoo parking lot, and they obliged without needing to discuss it, and her feet came off the ground and she shrieked with pleasure, and Mason caught Avery's eye over Sophie's head. She was smiling. Not the careful version, not the public-facing one he'd seen in photos. The actual one, the one that was slightly asymmetrical and reached all the way up. He thought, I need to tell her what I've been seeing. Not yet, but soon. The call came on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail that Mason would remember later. Not a dramatic day. No particular significance, just Tuesday. He was picking Sophie up from preschool when Avery called instead of texting, and his read of her was good enough by now to know that calls meant something was wrong. He got Sophie buckled in and answered with the car in park. I need to tell you something, she said. No preamble. He respected that. Tell me. There's a man named Gerald Poole. He was one of my early investors. Not a good one. Not someone I chose. Someone who came with the territory of the first funding round before I had enough leverage to be selective. He's been out of the company for 4 years. She paused. He's been contacting my board members through back channels, telling them that there are financial irregularities in our third quarter filings and that he has documentation to prove it. Mason was quiet. Sophie was singing something softly in the back seat. Does he? No, there are no irregularities. We've been audited 3 times in the past 2 years and our books are clean. Her voice was controlled, but he knew what controlled sounded like when it was covering something else. But if he plants this with enough board members, it creates enough doubt that I could be asked to step aside pending an investigation. And even if the investigation clears me, which it would, the damage to the company in that window could be significant. Avery, Mason said. What? That's not everything. A pause. No, she admitted. It's not. He waited. Someone came to my apartment building last Wednesday. Not to my door, to the lobby. Talked to the doorman, said they were a delivery service, got a description of my unit's floor. The doorman told me because he thought it was odd. She stopped. And my assistant told me today that someone's been calling the main office line asking questions about my schedule. When I'm in. When I leave. Phrased as someone trying to book an appointment, but the questions were specific in the wrong direction. Who has Poole worked with before, Mason said. Outside your industry. Do you know his other business interests? He has some real estate holdings. Some offshore investment vehicles I could never fully trace. When I pushed to buy him out 4 years ago, he told me I'd regret it. She paused. I took that as standard bravado. It might not have been. Mason put both hands on the steering wheel. Not going anywhere, just needing to hold something. Okay. I want you to do a few things. First, don't vary your schedule yet. If someone's tracking it, changing it suddenly tells them you know. Second, I want the name of your head of building security. Third, I need everything you have on Poole. Business history, associates, litigation, everything public, and whatever you have private. Silence on the line. Then, Mason, this isn't... I know, he said. I'm not on active duty. I'm a guy with a daughter in the back seat in a school parking lot. I know. That's not what I was going to say. Her voice was quieter. I was going to say this isn't your problem to carry. You're right, he said, but I'm going to carry it anyway. You can fight me on that, or you can send me what I asked for. Another pause. Longer. I'll send you what I have tonight, she said. Good. He glanced in the rear view. Sophie had stopped singing and was looking at Bun Bun with her serious face. Avery? Yeah. You're going to be fine. You don't know that. No, he said. But I know Gerald Poole has never dealt with someone who has my particular set of institutional knowledge. So I'm not overly worried. He didn't tell her everything he'd already noticed. Not because he was hiding it. He wasn't. He would tell her all of it. But because the sequence mattered. He needed what she had first, then he could lay it against what he'd already observed, and from there he could build an accurate picture. Acting on an incomplete picture was how you got people hurt. He spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table after Sophie was in bed, going through what Avery sent him. Gerald Poole was 61, had a history of aggressive business tactics that had twice ended in settled lawsuits, settlements with non-disclosure clauses, which was its own kind of information. He had documented ties to 2 private security contractors with questionable reputations in the industry, one of which had been investigated for corporate espionage 5 years ago without sufficient evidence to prosecute. That last part was the piece Mason had been looking for. He called a man named Dex, which was short for something no one used anymore, who had been in his unit for 6 years and now ran a private investigations firm in Portland. They talked for 40 minutes. Mason laid out what he had. Dex said he'd make some calls. This feel professional to you? Dex asked. Or amateur? Professional, Mason said. Controlled. It's got a shape to it. Escalating pressure, not random. Someone's building toward a moment. What moment? I don't know yet. That's what worries me. You going to handle this yourself or do you want me in? Both, Mason said. I want your eyes on the public record end. I'll handle anything closer in. Closer in, Dex repeated, meaning you're already near the target. Meaning I have a personal interest, Mason said. Different thing. Dex was quiet for a second. This the Sinclair woman Daniel mentioned? Daniel mentions too many things. He's proud of himself. So are you handling this or are you... Both, Mason said again. Send me what you find. Chut. He told Avery about the SUV and the parking garage and the things he'd been cataloging over the past weeks on a Friday night at her apartment, the first time he'd been there. She'd invited him when Sophie was having an overnight at Daniel's place, a new development in the Sophie-Daniel relationship that Sophie had enthusiastically negotiated herself. Her apartment was on the 14th floor of a building in the East Side District, and it was large and well-furnished, and it looked in some way he couldn't fully articulate, slightly like a hotel, like someone had curated it carefully and then not fully inhabited it. Her work bag was on the kitchen island. Her shoes were by the door. But the surfaces were clear in the particular way of someone who spent most of their hours somewhere else. He told her at the kitchen island, coffee in front of both of them. And when he got to the parts he'd been holding back, the SUV, the parking garage, the pattern he'd identified before she'd even called him, she went still. You saw all of that, she said. Yes. Before I told you about Poole? Yes. She looked at him steadily. Why didn't you say anything? Because I didn't have enough to be sure, and telling you there might be a threat when I can't define it yet does more harm than good. It makes people alter their behavior in ways that can tip off whoever's watching, and I needed to wait until I had a fuller picture. That's very tactical. That's the job, he said. Was the job. She picked up her coffee and held it. You were watching out for me, she said. Not an accusation, something else. Yeah. Before we were... She stopped. Yes. She set the mug down. Mason, you can't just... She paused. You can't just quietly keep people safe without telling them. I can, actually. I'm pretty good at it. That's not the... She exhaled. I need to be a part of decisions about my own safety. That's non-negotiable. Agreed, he said. Which is why I'm telling you now, when I have something concrete. She looked at him for a long moment. You're going to be very difficult to argue with about things like this, aren't you? Probably. She reached across the island and put her hand over his briefly. Not a long gesture, just contact. Then she pulled back and said, "Okay, what do we do?" He walked her through it. Dex's involvement, what the public record search had already returned on Poole's associates, the private security contractors, and what their methods typically looked like. He'd already contacted a former colleague now working with a federal financial crimes unit and passed along the documentation about the board communication. Framed correctly, it potentially constituted securities fraud, which elevated the entire situation from a corporate dispute to something with real legal teeth. If Poole is trying to manipulate your board members using fabricated documentation, Mason said, he's not just being a bad ex-investor. He's potentially committing securities fraud. That changes what kind of investigation we're dealing with. Avery was quiet. He could see her processing it. Not with fear, with that particular focused intelligence she brought to problems in the boardroom. She was categorizing, sequencing, figuring out where she needed to act. "I need to brief my legal team," she said. "Tomorrow morning. Tonight I want to walk through your building's security protocols. There are some gaps." She looked at him. "You already identified gaps?" "While I was waiting for you to buzz me up, yeah." She stared at him for a second and then said, without quite masking it, "You are actually insane. Former Navy SEAL. Some habits don't go away." Apparently none of them do. But there was something in her voice that wasn't irritation. The thing about Avery was that she didn't go small when she was scared. He'd expected it, because most people contracted under pressure. They went quiet, they deferred, they needed someone else to hold the shape of the situation. Avery did something different. She got precise. She got faster, sharper, and the warmth she normally kept somewhat under wraps went underground completely, and what emerged was someone who ran a company worth nearly $1 billion and had reasons for that. She was on the phone with her general counsel by 7 the next morning. By noon, she'd convened an emergency meeting with her two most trusted board members. By mid-afternoon, those board members had independently confirmed that Poole had been in contact with 3 others, and the documentation he was circulating was, as Mason had suspected, fabricated. A sophisticated fabrication, but fabricated, and the timestamps didn't hold up under technical analysis. She called Mason at 4 and said, "The timestamps were wrong." "I know." "You knew?" "I suspected. Documents like that usually have one flaw. Whoever made these didn't account for the server time zone on the system they pulled the originals from." A beat. "How do you know that?" "I've seen it before. Different context." "Different context," she repeated, with the tone of someone filing something away. "Okay. What does this mean legally?" "It means your general counsel has something real to work with. It means whoever Poole hired to fabricate these has a problem. And it means the pressure campaign is going to feel like it's escalating before it collapses, because that's what these things do. Whoever's behind it is going to push harder when they realize it's not working." "That's not comforting. It wasn't meant to be." "It was meant to be accurate." He paused. "How are you actually doing?" A silence, longer than the others. "I'm fine." "Avery." She stopped. "I'm angry. I'm really angry. I built this thing for 12 years, and someone who contributed 6 months of capital at the beginning thinks he can take a piece of it by threatening my board and sending people to ask about my schedule, and—" Her voice had gone tight. "I'm not scared. I'm furious." "Good," he said. "Angry is better. Angry is useful." "I thought you were supposed to tell me to calm down." "Why would I do that? You're right to be angry. Channel it into the legal process and let your counsel do what you're paying them for." He paused. "And keep your building security on notice. I've already sent your head of security 3 specific recommendations. Tell him I want them implemented by Monday." "You sent recommendations to my head of security?" "This morning, without asking me. I told you I was going to look at the protocols. This is what that looks like in practice." A very long pause. "Mason Reed," she said, in a tone he couldn't fully read. "Yeah. I don't know whether to thank you or be annoyed with you." "You can do both," he said. "I can handle it." What happened next was quieter than it had felt coming. The legal team filed. The federal contact Mason had reached out to got involved at a level that made Poole's corporate lawyers suddenly much less interested in their client's campaign. Dex turned up a financial connection between Poole and one of the private security contractors that the federal investigators found considerably more interesting than the securities fraud component. Within 3 weeks, the pressure on Avery's board members had stopped. Within 5, Poole had 3 separate legal problems that made the Sinclair Company the least of his concerns. It ended not with a confrontation, but with a silence where the threat used to be, which was how these things ended when they were handled correctly. Mason didn't tell her about the night in the parking garage until it was over. He'd identified the man who'd been in the garage, through Dex, through 2 other contacts, through the kind of careful reverse engineering that he'd spent a decade getting fast at. The man's name didn't matter particularly. What mattered was that he'd been hired to document Avery's movements, and that he'd been at her building twice since the lobby incident, and that Mason had spent an evening making it extremely clear to him, without touching him, without saying anything that could be legally actionable, that continuing this particular employment was going to cause him more problems than the money was worth. The man had not been back. When Mason told her, 3 days after the fact, sitting on his back porch with the November air cold enough to make their coffee steam, she looked at him for a long time. "Just to clarify," she said, "you located this man, went to where he was, and had a conversation that made him stop. That's accurate. And you're only telling me now. The situation's resolved. I didn't want you worried about something I was already handling." She put her mug down. "Mason, we talked about this. About telling me things. We talked about it in the context of security decisions. This was operational. That's a distinction you've invented. It's a distinction that exists." She looked at him with the expression she got when she was choosing her words carefully, which was not her natural setting. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I'm not someone who needs to be managed. I'm not someone who needs things handled around her instead of with her. I know that." "Do you? Because this is twice now that you've—" "I know," he said. "You're right." He looked at the yard, the dark square of it, the listing slide. "I'm wired to handle threats and not advertise the handling. That's not a line I can completely unwire. But I hear you." She picked up her mug again. "I'm not asking you to unwire it. I'm asking you to loop me in." "I can do that." "Can you?" He met her eyes. "Yes, I can do that." She looked at him for another moment and then nodded once, the way she did when she'd decided to accept something and move on. "Okay. Okay." The cold air sat between them comfortably. From inside the house, the baby monitor on the porch railing made the small static sounds that meant Sophie was shifting in her sleep, but not waking. "Are you okay?" she asked. "After the parking garage thing." He looked at her. "It was a conversation, Avery. I know what you didn't do. I'm asking if you're okay." He considered it. Not the quick version, not the reflexive fine. Actually considered it. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay. It felt... I've been out of that world long enough that going back to the edge of it is strange. It doesn't feel like relief the way it used to. It feels more like..." He paused. "Like visiting somewhere you used to live that's been remodeled. You know where you are, but it's not yours anymore." Avery was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's actually exactly how I felt the last time I walked into a room with Gerald Poole." She looked at her coffee. "That world. The early funding world. The one where I had to smile at men who were betting I'd fail and act grateful for the capital." She shook her head slightly. "Not mine anymore. But I still know where everything is." He looked at her. She was staring at the yard, her profile in the porch light, the particular set of her jaw that she didn't know was the tell for the things she didn't say. He thought about what she'd told him on his porch weeks ago. "The things I've looked forward to the most have also been the things I've lost the fastest." He thought about Sophie asleep inside, and Bun Bun and Peanut on their respective sides, and the coffee getting cold in his hand. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the armrest. She turned her hand over and held his, and neither of them said anything for a while. And the monitor kept its small static sound, and the cold pressed in at the edges of the porch light, and it was enough. It was, for right now, exactly enough. Winter came to Seattle the way it usually did. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, the cold settling in layer by layer until one morning you looked out the window and realized the light had changed completely, and you'd stopped expecting warmth without noticing. Mason noticed it on a Tuesday morning in December when he went out to scrape the windshield before the preschool run, and his breath made clouds, and Sophie, watching from the doorway in her coat, said, "Daddy, you're a dragon," with the certainty of someone making a scientific observation. He said, "Get your backpack. And she disappeared inside, and he stood there for a second with the scraper in his hand, looking at the neighborhood in its gray winter state, and thought about how different the past 4 months felt from the 4 months before them. Different wasn't a strong enough word. Different implied variation in the same category. This was more like a different category entirely. Avery had become a constant in a way he hadn't planned for and hadn't tried to resist. She was at the house 3 or 4 evenings a week. She knew where the good plates were, and also where the chipped ones were, and which ones Sophie preferred because Sophie had opinions about plates. She knew that the third stair from the bottom creaked, and had learned to step over it during Sophie's nap time without being told. She knew that Mason made bad coffee at home, and excellent coffee with a proper machine, and she'd appeared one Saturday with a French press and a bag of beans from the good place near her office, and left them on the counter without comment, which was exactly the right way to do it. Sophie had stopped asking if Avery was coming over and started asking what time. Mason had noticed the shift the week it happened and had held it in his mind carefully, the way you hold something you're afraid of dropping. Not because it worried him exactly, more because it required him to be honest about what he was doing. And honesty with himself was something he'd always found harder than honesty with anyone else. He was in love with her. He'd known it for weeks. He hadn't said it because saying it required him to believe it could stay, and that was the part he was still negotiating with. It was Avery who named it first, which surprised him, because she was in many ways more guarded about that territory than he was. They were in the kitchen on a Friday night, Sophie already in bed, the dishes done, the particular quiet of the house. After Sophie was down that Mason had once found heavy and now mostly found comfortable. Avery was on her laptop at the table, working through something from the office. There was always something from the office. And Mason was reading on the couch, and they hadn't talked in 40 minutes. And it was fine. It was easy in the way that shared silence is only easy when it's earned. Then Avery closed her laptop. Not the normal halfway shut that meant she was taking a break. All the way. He looked up. She was looking at him with the expression she got when she'd been thinking about something for longer than she wanted to admit. "Can I say something?" "Yeah." She turned the closed laptop once with both hands, a quarter rotation. "I love you." She said it without a run-up, no softening context, just the statement. Then, "I've known for a while and I didn't want to say it until I was sure I wasn't saying it for the wrong reasons." Mason set his book down on the couch. "What are the wrong reasons?" "Because I'm grateful. Because you helped me with pool. Because Sophie does something, and I'm sitting next to you when it happens, and it feels good, and I don't want to confuse gratitude and proximity for something." She stopped. "I've done that before. Made that error. And it cost me. Someone you loved. Someone I thought I loved. The difference being that I'm not sure I was ever actually seeing him clearly." She looked at the laptop, then back up. "I see you clearly. I don't think you're perfect. I know specifically how you're not perfect. And I still—" She paused. "So, that's what I wanted to say." Mason stood up and crossed the kitchen, and she tipped her face up, and he held it in both hands for a second, just looking at her, and then said, "I love you too. For the record, I've known for a while also." She said, "How long?" "The popsicle morning." She stared at him. "That was month 1. "I know." "Mason." "I was taking my time," he said. "You told me you needed people to be honest with you. That's me being honest." She laughed, startled, the real one, and he kissed her once, and she put her hand flat on his chest and said, "You waited 4 months to tell me something you knew in month 1. "I didn't say I handled it well." "You really didn't." But she was still laughing, and he was close enough that he could feel it, and outside the kitchen window the December dark pressed against the glass, and it was the first time in longer than he could calculate that the inside of his own house felt entirely warm. Christmas was going to be at his place. This had been established by Sophie 3 weeks in advance through a series of negotiations that had not technically included either adults' formal agreement, but had been concluded unilaterally by Sophie nonetheless. "Avery is coming," Sophie had announced at breakfast. Not a question. "I'll invite her," Mason said. "She's already coming," Sophie said. "I told her." He'd looked at his daughter for a moment. "When did you talk to Avery?" "She called to say goodnight, and I told her about Christmas." He'd stopped. Avery had started calling to say goodnight to Sophie. He hadn't known that, or hadn't registered when it started, but clearly it had become a thing, and clearly Sophie was now using it for diplomatic purposes. What exactly did you tell her? That she has to come for Christmas because Peanut needs her. Sophie looked at him with her serious face. Peanut is very attached. Avery had texted him that same evening. I've been formally summoned for Christmas by Peanut. I said yes. Hope that's okay. He'd replied, It's okay. Peanut is very persuasive. She really is. Takes after Sophie. The week before Christmas, Daniel came over for dinner, and the four of them, Mason, Avery, Daniel, and Sophie, ate around the kitchen table in the specific organized chaos that resulted from Sophie's policy of including Bun Bun and Peanut in all social gatherings, which meant the stuffed animals were at the table too, and Daniel had to be informed of their dietary preferences before dinner. Bun Bun doesn't eat carrots, Sophie told him seriously. She's been through a lot. Daniel, who was a grown man with a graduate degree, nodded and moved the carrots to one side of the serving dish. Understood. What about Peanut? Sophie considered. Peanut is still deciding. Developmentally appropriate, Daniel said, and caught Mason's eye across the table with an expression of barely suppressed laughter. After dinner, after Sophie had gone to bed and the three adults had moved to the living room, Daniel sat back in the armchair with his wine and looked between Avery and Mason with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose idea had worked out better than expected. I'm not going to say I told you so, he said. You're literally about to say it, Mason said. I told you so. He raised his glass toward Avery. Sorry. He was very resistant to this. I want you to know the full backstory. I know the full backstory, Avery said. He told me. Daniel looked at Mason with something like affection. You actually told her? We had a conversation, yes. He was going to cancel, Daniel told Avery. I know. He was going to text me that morning. But he didn't. But he didn't, Avery agreed. Mason looked between the two of them. I'm in the room. We're aware, Daniel said. That's what makes it fun. He set his glass down. All right, I'm being genuine for a second, which I know makes everyone uncomfortable. He looked at Mason. You doing okay? Actually okay. The question had more layers than it sounded. Mason understood them all. Yeah, he said. I am. Good. Daniel nodded. He seemed to want to say more and then decided against it. Good. Avery was looking at Mason sideways. He caught the look and understood it. She was filing away what Daniel had just asked, the subtext in it, the concern underneath the brevity. He'd told her some of it. The deployment, the decision he carried, not all of it. Some things took longer. Christmas itself was loud and imperfect, in the ways that households with small children are loud and imperfect. Sophie was awake at 5:45, which was the law of the day, and she found the two adults asleep on the couch and armchair respectively. Avery had stayed over, in the guest room, and had come downstairs at some point and apparently fallen asleep sitting up, which was how Mason found her when Sophie's arrival woke him. Sophie stood between them and looked at the sleeping Avery and then at Mason with an expression that said she found this both hilarious and inconvenient, given there were presents. Wake her up nice, Mason said, in a voice still thick with sleep. Sophie considered her approach. Then she climbed carefully up onto the armchair, which was large enough for both of them, and sat next to Avery and put her hand on Avery's arm and said, in her most responsible voice, Avery, it's Christmas. Avery opened her eyes, blinked, found Sophie approximately 6 inches from her face. Merry Christmas, sweetheart, she said, in a voice like gravel, which made Sophie giggle. They did the presents in the living room in the early gray light. Sophie had developed a gift-opening style that involved extreme focus and great ceremony, each item examined thoroughly before the next was attempted. Avery had gotten her a set of building blocks that could be assembled into different animals, and when Sophie figured out that they could also be assembled incorrectly in ways that produced nonsense creatures, she became very excited about that instead. This one is a dog with 8 legs, she announced, holding it up. That's a spider dog, Avery said. Very rare. It needs a name. Steve, Mason said from the kitchen where he was starting coffee. Sophie seemed to feel Steve was adequate. Mason had gotten Avery something small, a first edition of a book she'd mentioned once, in passing, that she'd read when she was building the company in those early Portland years, a novel she'd described as the thing that had kept her company when the rest of it was chaos. He'd spent 3 weeks locating a copy in reasonable condition. He'd wrapped it badly. as he wrapped everything. She opened it and went still. Mason, her voice was quiet. You said it was important. You remembered that. Not a question. She was looking at the cover, turning it over once. I mentioned it once. You said it was the book you read when you didn't know if any of it was going to work. He poured the coffee. That seemed worth remembering. She looked up at him. Sophie was on the floor assembling a second spider dog and narrating its biography. The tree lights were on and the gray morning light was coming through the windows. Avery held the book in both hands and looked at him with something that she didn't cover up or manage, and he let it sit there. Thank you, she said. Yeah, he said, and gave her the coffee. Whoops. January came cold and clear, and with it came the thing Mason had been carrying since October, the thing he'd been putting down in pieces with Avery but hadn't fully set down yet, his last deployment, the decision. He told her the broad shape of it, that he'd lost someone, that he'd made a call he wasn't sure about, that it had ended his certainty in himself enough to make him leave. He hadn't told her the specifics. Partly operational habit, partly because you couldn't unsay those things once they were said. It was Avery who opened the door, not by asking directly, but by doing what she did when something mattered. She got quiet in a specific way, a listening quiet, and let it sit there until things moved toward it. They were on the porch again. February this time, genuinely cold, 2 mugs of actual good coffee from the French press she'd brought. Sophie was inside with a movie on. There was no particular reason for this moment except that it had arrived the way these things do, without announcement. His name was Torres, Mason said. He hadn't planned to start there, but that was where it started. Corporal Ramon Torres, 26 years old. He'd been in my unit for 8 months. Avery didn't say anything. She held her mug. We were on a target in a building that was supposed to be clear, Mason said. Intelligence said clear. I had a read on it that wasn't consistent with clear. Something off about the entry point. The kind of thing that's not visual, it's, you just know. You train for years to listen to that and not override it. He paused. I overrode it. Timeline pressure. We needed to be in and out before a window closed. The cold air sat between them. Torres went in second, Mason said. There was a secondary inside. He got Torres. He stopped. Started again. The secondary was a kid. A kid. Couldn't have been older than 14, 15. Armed, yes. Dangerous, yes. But a kid who probably had no more choice in that room than Torres did. Avery was very still. I made the call on the timeline. And because I made that call, Torres died and I had to make another call about a 15-year-old, and I did what the situation required, and he stopped. And I went home 3 weeks later and I held Sophie, and I thought about Torres's mother, who I'd spoken to at the funeral, and about that kid's mother somewhere, who would never know what happened or where, and I thought, I can't keep being the person who makes those calls. He hadn't said all of that out loud before. Not to Daniel, not to the debrief counselor he'd seen 3 times before stopping, not to anyone. Avery set her mug down on the porch railing. She turned in her chair to face him directly. Mason. Don't tell me it wasn't my fault, he said. I've been told that. I wasn't going to, she said. He looked at her. I was going to say that you've been carrying a weight that was too heavy for one person for 2 years, and I think you know that. And I think you also know that nothing I say changes what happened or makes it resolve cleanly, so I'm not going to try. She held his gaze. But I want you to know that I know this part of you now, and I'm not going anywhere. His jaw was tight. He looked at the yard. Torres died because of decisions made at every level above the timeline call, she said, including whoever gave the bad intelligence, including whoever set the window. I know you've been told versions of that and dismissed them. I'm not trying to convince you, I'm just laying it there. Because it's true. She paused. And because I think the version of events you've been living inside of has you as the only person responsible for everything. And that's not accurate. And it's also not survivable long term. He breathed. I'm not asking you to let it go, she said. I don't think it works that way. I think you carry it differently over time, if you're lucky. I think you learn to put it down more often. You sound like you know something about that. She was quiet for a moment. My mother died when I was 23. Car accident. She said it plainly, the same way he told her about Julie. Right in the middle of the company's first year. And I made every decision in that first year from a place of, I think I was trying to outrun it. If I built fast enough, if I worked hard enough. If the thing succeeded, then at least something that year had gone right. She paused. I carried that for a long time without naming it, calling it ambition, calling it drive. It wasn't. It was just grief with a business plan. He looked at her. We're both carrying things, she said. That's okay. That's not a problem to solve. I want us to carry them next to each other, not separately. He reached over and took her hand and she held it, and that was where they stayed, in the cold, until the movie inside reached its end and Sophie appeared at the back door and said, Daddy, can I have a snack? And the ordinary world reasserted itself entirely. What? Spring came incrementally, the same way winter had gone. And with the spring came changes that nobody had explicitly voted on, but that had nonetheless occurred. Avery's lease was up in March. She hadn't brought it up directly, but Mason had noticed the way she talked about her apartment. Less a home she was returning to, more a place she was maintaining. She mentioned the lease in passing on a Wednesday evening, and he said, without overthinking it, You spend 4 nights a week here, more some weeks. I know, she said. I have a guest room that's mostly used for your spare laptop charger and a box of Sophie's art supplies. She looked at him. Mason, I'm not trying to pressure anything. I'm observing a practical reality. You're terrible at casual, she said. I know. She looked at him for a long moment. If I moved in, it would be a real thing. I want to make sure you know that. I'm not built for halfway. I know you're not. And Sophie's going to be ecstatic and you know it. I know. She paused. I want to make sure we're doing this for us, not because it makes the logistics cleaner. It's both, he said. Both can be true. She turned that over. He watched her do it. The weighing, the careful assessment, the way she handled a decision that mattered. Then she said, I want to look at the lease timing and figure out the right month. April or May work, he said. We can clear the guest room. We're going to need a dresser. I know. The one in there is terrible. I know. I've had it since 2015. She made a face that said this explained a lot. Okay, she said. Okay. He didn't make a production of it. Neither did she. But that night, after Avery had gone to take a call from her assistant, Mason walked past the guest room and looked at it. The spare charger on the desk, the box of Sophie's drawings, the terrible dresser from 2015, and thought about what it would look like when it was hers, and felt something settle in him that he hadn't known was still unsettled. Sophie found out on a Saturday morning when Avery was over and Mason said carefully that they wanted to talk to her about something. Sophie looked between them with the focused attention she reserved for important matters. What happened? She said, with the gravity of someone braced for news. Nothing bad happened, Mason said. We wanted to ask you how you'd feel about Avery coming to live here. A pause. Sophie's face went through about 4 things in rapid succession. Then she said, with tremendous restraint, For always? For always, Avery said. Sophie looked at her, then at Mason, then back at Avery. Then she got up from the kitchen chair, walked to Avery, and put both arms around her waist and leaned in and didn't say anything. Avery looked at Mason over Sophie's head. Her eyes were bright. She needs a room, Sophie said into Avery's shirt, her voice slightly muffled. She can't sleep in the guest room. The dresser is terrible. Mason looked at the ceiling. Noted. We'll get a new dresser, Bug, Avery said, and her voice had something in it that she was working to hold steady. With the round handles, Sophie said, not the flat ones. Round handles, Mason said. Absolutely non-negotiable. Sophie tightened her arms once and then let go with the abrupt conclusion of a 4-year-old, and went back to her seat and said, Can I have more orange juice? Avery laughed and pressed the back of her hand briefly to her mouth, and Mason poured the orange juice, and the kitchen was full in a way that made the rest of the house feel warm by proximity. She moved in on a Saturday in May with more boxes than either of them had anticipated and less furniture than she'd owned, which turned out to be because she'd been living in that apartment the way you live in a hotel. Functionally, provisionally, without fully unpacking. Some of her boxes had been taped shut for 2 years. Daniel came to help and spent most of the time making observations about Mason's organizational system that Mason did not ask for. Sophie supervised from the hallway with the authority of someone who had been waiting for this for several months. The new dresser arrived that afternoon. Round handles. Sophie had been very clear.
By evening, the boxes were mostly in rooms and the dresser was assembled, only slightly wrong in one drawer that Mason had to redo twice because Daniel kept reading the instructions aloud incorrectly. Avery had taken over the kitchen unpacking and had already reorganized the cabinet where the mugs went, which she'd been wanting to do since October and had held off on because it wasn't her cabinet. It was her cabinet now. She reorganized it entirely, with the focused satisfaction of someone completing a task they'd been deferring. Mason watched her from the doorway. He thought about the first day at the park, the careful composure, the way she'd positioned herself with her back toward the open space. He thought about the living room floor with the popsicle wrapper. He thought about the porch in November and February, and the book he'd found, and Sophie's arms around her waist in the kitchen. He thought about how long the road from that first afternoon had been, all the places where it could have veered off into nothing, all the choices that were smaller than they looked but had accumulated into this Saturday evening in May with boxes in the hallway and a badly assembled dresser drawer, and Daniel reading instructions wrong, and Sophie asleep on the couch with Bun Bun and Peanut because she'd crashed mid-supervision. He didn't say any of that. He just leaned in the doorway and watched Avery arrange mugs with the purposeful calm of someone who had found a thing that fit and was now, finally, allowing herself to put it down and stay. "You move the big mugs to the front," he said. "The big mugs are better," she said, without looking up. This was always the logical arrangement. "I had a system. You had a legacy system that predated both of us." She put the last mug up. "It's been replaced." He pushed off from the doorframe and crossed the kitchen and came up behind her, and she turned into him, and his arms went around her and she leaned back for a second, and they stood there in the kitchen that was now both of theirs. "Welcome home," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I haven't had one of those in a while." He held on. The night outside the window was the long May kind, still light at the edges at 8 o'clock. Down the hall, Sophie slept with her two animals flanking her, all three of them safe and still. "You do now," he said. They settled into the house the way people settle into things that are actually going to last. Imperfectly, with friction, with small adjustments that accumulated over weeks, until one day the friction was mostly gone, and what remained was just the ordinary texture of shared life. Avery had opinions about where the couch faced. Mason had opinions about the thermostat. These opinions were incompatible. The couch compromise lasted 3 weeks before they moved it again. The thermostat was an ongoing negotiation that Sophie had no patience for and periodically tried to resolve by putting on a sweater and announcing it loudly so both adults would feel guilty. It worked, occasionally. Avery's work hours were the hardest part of the early months. Not because Mason hadn't known about them. He'd seen them up close for a year, but because knowing a thing from the outside and living with it from the inside were different in ways he hadn't fully mapped. She came home late most Tuesdays and Thursdays, sometimes 9, sometimes later, and he'd have dinner in the refrigerator and Sophie already in bed. And she'd eat alone at the kitchen table with her laptop open, and he'd sit across from her and drink the end of the evening coffee. And they wouldn't talk much, but the company was there, and that seemed to matter to her in a way she'd described once, carefully, as being the difference between coming home and arriving somewhere. He understood that. He had his own version of late nights, except his were the insomniac kind. The 2, 3 a.m. wake, where something he couldn't name had pulled him up to the surface and left him lying in the dark listening to the house. Those happened less than they used to. He'd been honest with himself about that, and about why. The house had a different sound now with 3 people in it, fuller, less echo. Still, there were nights when the image of Torres came through clean and specific, the way memory doesn't actually fade, it just visits less often. On those nights, he'd get up carefully so as not to wake Avery and sit at the kitchen table in the dark, and sometimes she'd appear anyway because she was a light sleeper and had gotten tuned to when he wasn't there. She never asked what it was about. She already knew. She'd come in and make 2 cups of tea she hadn't particularly wanted and sit across from him, and they'd sit there until it passed, which it always did eventually. She didn't try to fix it. He didn't ask her to. The sitting was enough. The fact that she came downstairs was enough. They both had scars they couldn't show. They were both learning to be in the room with each other's. The anniversary arrived on a Tuesday. Not theirs. Sophie's. The 18th month mark since Julie had died had passed without Mason actively counting. But Sophie's anniversary was different.
Exactly 1 year since the afternoon at Riverside Park, since Bubbles and Ducks and the old man named Walt with the watermelon, since the moment Sophie had touched Avery's cheek in the parking lot and said the word that had stopped time. Mason realized the date when he was making Sophie's lunch, and a calendar notification came up on his phone that he hadn't set. Daniel, predictably, had put it in his calendar last year with a note that just read, "The park. Remember it." Because Daniel was the kind of person who did that, and Mason had never once acknowledged it, but also had never deleted it. He stood at the kitchen counter for a moment. A year. He thought about the man he'd been driving to that park. The tight chest, the near cancellation, the 2 shirt changes, the gray t-shirt and the baseball cap he'd worn as a form of armor, because at some point a person had to stop performing. He thought about Avery at the entrance with her hands in her jacket pockets and the careful posture of someone waiting to be disappointed. He looked down the hallway at the closed door of the room that was now legitimately hers, her office at home, set up over 3 weekends in June, with a desk she'd chosen and a chair she'd deliberated over and bookshelves Mason had built badly on a Saturday and had to rebuild the following Saturday because one had listed 4 degrees to the left. "Plumb line," Avery had said, holding it up. "I know what a plumb line is." And yet, he'd rebuilt the shelf. It was straight now. He was privately proud of it. He texted her, "Come to the park Saturday afternoon. The one with the ducks." "Bring nothing," she replied 20 minutes later, from what was presumably a meeting based on the brevity. "Okay." Then, 3 minutes after, "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine. I want to show you something." He spent the week working on it quietly, which was not easy with a 4-year-old in the house who had Sophie's level of observational acuity. She noticed the photo album. He'd started at a print shop 2 days after deciding, ordering prints of everything he had from the past year, which turned out to be more than he'd realized he'd been taking. He wasn't a photographer in any deliberate sense, but his phone, it turned out, had been quietly accumulating evidence. Sophie chasing Bubbles at the park. The zoo. 3 visits worth. Sophie's face at the giraffe, at the butterfly glass, at the completely indifferent sea lion who'd become her favorite because of its indifference. The preschool pageant, Sophie mid-rotation in her snowflake stance. Christmas morning, the Spider Dog Assembly Project. Avery asleep in the armchair with Sophie tucked beside her, which he had not technically asked permission to photograph, but also could not have not taken. The kitchen after the move-in, mugs reorganized, Avery's hand visible at the frame's edge. The back porch in February, 2 coffee mugs on the railing, no people visible but their absence shaped like presents. He picked the album up at the print shop on Friday and spent an hour at the kitchen table when Sophie was napping, sliding the photos into the sleeves in sequence. Not perfect sequence. Some were slightly out of order because life doesn't arrange itself into clean chronology. But the shape of the year was there, visible, all the things that had accumulated from one park afternoon outward. He left the last 6 sleeves empty. He wasn't sure when that decision arrived. It just felt right in the way that the best decisions do. Not dramatic, not the product of deliberate analysis, just clearly correct when he reached it. Saturday was the kind of late September afternoon that Seattle occasionally offered as apology for everything else. Clear and gold and cool without being cold. The light at the angle that made everything look like a photograph someone had taken on purpose. They drove to Riverside Park with Sophie between them in the back seat, conducting a conversation with Bun Bun about ducks that demonstrated she had not lowered her expectations of them in the past 12 months. Avery had her window down slightly, her arm on the door, and she was watching the neighborhoods go by with the settled expression of someone who wasn't performing at being relaxed, was actually relaxed. Mason caught her eye in the rear view, and she gave him a small look that said she knew something was happening and was giving him room to get there on his own. He appreciated that. He always appreciated the way she gave him room. The park was moderately populated. Families, a couple of dog walkers, 2 older men playing chess at the stone tables near the east entrance. Sophie deployed immediately toward the duck pond with the focus of a professional. They followed. The ducks were exactly where they'd always been. Sophie's assessment of their population, 3 new ones, Daddy, I can tell, was delivered with the confidence of a wildlife biologist, and he didn't dispute it. They walked the main path, the same path from a year ago. Mason had the album under his arm. Sophie ran ahead, circled back, made discoveries, reported them. The light came through the trees at the angle that made it nearly horizontal, warm and long. Near the north bench, the bench where they'd sat when he'd gotten up to help Walt, where Avery had sat on the floor and listened to Sophie explain Bun Bun's target incident, Mason stopped. "Sit here for a second," he said. Avery sat. Sophie, who had been investigating something on the ground, came over with the instinct children have for important moments and climbed up onto the bench beside Avery with the naturalness of someone sitting next to someone they belonged to. Mason sat on the other side and held the album for a moment and then set it in Avery's lap. "Open it," he said. She looked down at it. Brown cover, no label. She opened it. He watched her go through it. Not quickly. She took her time with each page, and Sophie leaned over to look too, narrating her own presence in several photos with great enthusiasm. "That's me! That's me with the giraffe! That's my snowflake costume! Daddy, that's Peanut!" Avery didn't say anything for the first several pages. Her face was doing things she wasn't managing, which meant she'd decided not to manage them, which was its own kind of trust. She got to the photo of herself asleep in the armchair with Sophie tucked in beside her. She stopped there for a moment. "You took this." "Sophie wanted me to prove to Bun Bun that you two had fallen asleep together. It was a legal documentation request." She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. She kept going. She got to the empty sleeves at the end. Her fingers went to them, and she felt the blankness of them, the pages waiting. She looked up at him. He had thought about how to say what he wanted to say. He'd thought about it all week, various versions, some too formal, some too compressed, none of them quite right. He'd given up on finding the right version and decided to just say the true version. "I spent the first year after Sophie was born trying to make sure nothing got close enough to hurt her," he said. "I built the perimeter out wide enough that I was also inside it, just me and her against everything." He paused. "And then you showed up on a day I'd been trying to cancel for 2 days, and Sophie called you mommy in a parking lot, and I stood there thinking, she knows something I don't." He stopped. Sophie was looking at him with serious eyes. She'd heard this tone before, but not often, but she recognized it. She put her hand in his, which he hadn't asked her to do. "I'm not going to tell you you're perfect," he said to Avery. "You already know you're not. You cancel things, and you go quiet when you're stressed, and you reorganized my mug cabinet without asking. And I didn't say anything because I'd been wanting someone to fix that cabinet for 2 years, and I was too stubborn to do it myself." He felt Sophie squeeze his hand. "I'm not perfect either. I handle things without looping you in, and I wake up at 3 in the morning, and I carry stuff in ways that are probably not healthy, and I once rebuilt a bookshelf twice because I couldn't admit I needed a plumb line." Avery's mouth curved. Her eyes were bright. "But I don't want to keep that cabinet the way it was before," he said. "I don't want to go back to the house being just quiet. I don't want Sophie to grow up without watching someone choose her. Not out of obligation, not out of accident, but because they want to." He looked at her directly. "I want you to marry me, not because it makes the logistics cleaner, even though it does. Because I love you and Sophie loves you, and the last empty pages in that album are supposed to be filled with whatever comes next for all 3 of us." He didn't have a ring in his pocket. He'd thought about that and decided against it, because Avery wasn't someone who received well in public, wasn't someone who liked the performance pressure of a box being opened in front of witnesses, however small the audience. She'd told him once, sideways, in the context of something else, that grand gestures made her nervous because they created an atmosphere where you couldn't respond honestly without seeming like you'd ruined something. He'd remembered that. Sophie looked at Avery. "Say yes," she said, in a tone of practical advice. Avery laughed, a real full one, and the tears she'd been managing spilled over in the way that happens when you laugh and cry at the same moment, and your body doesn't know which channel to use. She pressed both hands over her mouth for a second. Sophie, alarmed, patted her arm. "It's okay," Sophie said. "Sometimes I cry when I'm happy too. Daddy calls it the good kind." Avery lowered her hands. She looked at Sophie first, then at Mason. "Yes," she said. Her voice was rough and clear at the same time. "Yes? Of course, yes." Sophie pumped her fist. "I knew it," she said, with immense satisfaction, and then announced she was going to find the ducks and tell them, which she did, running toward the pond with the information. Mason took Avery's face in both hands and kissed her, and she was still half laughing and half crying, and it was slightly awkward in the way of real things. And when he pulled back, she leaned her forehead against his, and they sat there on the bench in the September light while Sophie delivered the news to the ducks, who received it with the dignified indifference for which they were known. They got married in November, 14 months after the park. Small, 20 people, maybe 22 if you counted the two colleagues of Avery's who arrived together and whom Mason hadn't previously met. The venue was a converted farmhouse 30 minutes outside of Seattle that Avery had found, and that was slightly impractical logistically and completely right in every other respect. Mason wore a suit he'd bought for the occasion, charcoal gray, with a tie Sophie had selected from 3 options with great seriousness. Avery wore a dress that was ivory and simple and exactly right in the way that simple things are exactly right, and she'd done her hair in a way Mason had never seen, partially up. And he'd told her she looked beautiful, and she'd said, "The bar is low, you've seen me at 3 a.m., and he'd said, "Especially then," and she'd given him a look that he would probably be thinking about for a while. Daniel was Mason's best man, which he'd known he would be since approximately the moment he'd agreed to go to the park on a Tuesday afternoon a year and a half ago. Daniel gave a toast that was funny in the first half and genuine in the second half in a way that required him to look at the ceiling for a moment before finishing, which was the most honest thing Mason had seen him do in 15 years of friendship. Sophie was the flower girl, a role she had prepared for with the focused intensity she brought to everything that mattered. She walked down the aisle with the seriousness of someone carrying out an important mission, dropping petals at intervals she'd calculated in advance. And when she reached the front, she stood next to Avery and held her hand, unprompted, for the entire ceremony. The person officiating read the vows they'd written, which were not long and not particularly literary because neither of them had wanted to perform at the ceremony. Mason said he promised to loop her in and to fix things she didn't know needed fixing, and to always have the good coffee, and to not rebuild any more bookshelves alone. Avery said she promised to come home and to say what she was thinking even when it was inconvenient, and to reorganize every cabinet in his house with or without permission, because all those cabinets had needed it. Sophie laughed when Avery said that. So did most of the room. They exchanged rings that Avery had chosen and Mason had approved, and Sophie had been shown in advance because her input had been solicited on the grounds that she had demonstrably good aesthetic judgment, having selected the round-handled dresser. When they were told they could kiss, Sophie said finally, loud enough to be heard at the back of the room, which got the biggest laugh of the night. The adoption took 4 months. Mason had expected it to be longer. The paperwork was considerable, the home study thorough, the legal process, the kind of thing that moves at the pace of official processes everywhere, which is to say slowly and with documentation. Avery had retained a family law attorney who had navigated the particulars with precision, and Mason had sat with Sophie and talked to her about what it meant in terms a 4-year-old could hold. "Avery's going to be your mom," he said, "in every way, legal way too." Sophie had looked at him. "She's already my mom," she said. "I already call her that." "In your head," he said, "and out loud when she's not listening." He'd looked at his daughter for a moment. "She is listening, Bug. She hears everything." Sophie seemed to find this satisfactory. "Okay," she said, "but also make it the paper kind." He'd called Avery that evening and reported this conversation, and there had been a silence on the phone that told him she'd had to put it down for a moment. The hearing was on a Thursday in March, a cold, clear morning, the kind that comes in late winter when the year is remembering it can be warm again. They drove to the courthouse with Sophie in the back seat in her good dress, blue, with small white stars, chosen by Sophie for what she described as official reasons, and Bun Bun in her lap because Bun Bun was family and family attended important things. The courtroom was smaller than Mason had expected. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Harriet Park, who had, according to Avery's attorney, presided over more adoption hearings than she could count, and who had a reputation for being both thorough and human about it. She looked at Sophie over her glasses when they entered and said, "You must be Sophie." Sophie straightened. "I am." "I've read a lot about you." Judge Park looked at the folder on her desk. "It says here that you have an extensive expertise in duck behavior." Sophie looked at her parents, both of them, there, present, and then back at the judge. "I've been studying them for over a year," she said. "Impressive." The judge picked up her pen. "Should we get started?" The legal proceedings took 31 minutes. Mason had braced for it to feel longer, the way official things often feel elongated by their own formality, but it moved with a kind of directness that he appreciated. The attorney answered the questions. Avery answered the questions directed at her with the same clear, unperformed honesty she brought to everything that mattered. Mason answered his. Sophie answered hers. The judge had addressed her directly, asked her in plain language if she understood what was happening and if she wanted it, and Sophie had said yes with the full confidence of someone who'd already decided this months ago and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Judge Park reviewed the final documents. She picked up her pen. She looked at the three of them over the top of her glasses. "Before I sign this," she said, "I want to say something that isn't required by the proceeding, but that I say when I feel it's true." She paused. "I've sat in this chair for a long time. I've seen families made in a lot of different ways. What I look for, what matters, past all the forms and the home studies and the boxes checked, is whether the people in front of me have already decided, whether the paper is catching up to something real." She looked at Sophie, then at Avery, then at Mason. "That's what I see today." She signed. The room was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then Sophie Reed Sinclair, as of that moment, if she chose to use it, and she would, she'd already decided, launched herself off the chair beside Mason and crossed the courtroom in approximately 4 running steps and threw her arms around Avery's waist with everything she had. Avery came forward out of her chair to catch her. Her arms went around Sophie completely, and she held on, and Sophie held on, and Mason watched his daughter's face pressed against Avery's shoulder, eyes closed, completely certain. "Mommy," Sophie said. The same word, the same voice. 1 year older and 10,000 things richer, and still the same word. Avery's face, over Sophie's shoulder, was the most undone he'd ever seen her, which was saying something, because he'd seen her in the February dark at 2 in the morning, and he'd seen her cry in a park, and he'd seen her the morning after a 20-hour work crisis, when she'd come home at dawn and fallen asleep on the couch, still in her coat. But this was different. This was the specific face of someone receiving something they'd stopped asking for. "Forever," Avery said into Sophie's hair. Her voice barely made it. "I've got you. Forever." Mason sat in the chair and let that be what it was, without trying to do anything about it. The attorney was doing something professional with papers. Judge Park had taken off her glasses and was looking at the window. The court clerk in the corner appeared to be finding her keyboard extremely interesting. Nobody was performing composure particularly well, and that seemed right to Mason. Some moments didn't need composure. Some moments needed to be exactly what they were. He got up and crossed to them and put his arms around both of them, and Sophie's hand found his sleeve from somewhere inside the embrace and held it, and they stood there in the middle of a small courtroom on a Thursday morning in March. And it was not elegant and it was not cinematic, and Sophie's dress had a small juice stain at the hem that they'd missed, and Bun Bun had fallen off the chair and was on the floor, and nobody had noticed yet. It was the best moment of his life. They went to the park afterward. Not Riverside, actually. Sophie requested the one with the big climbing structure, a different park, a newer one, closer to the house. The choice seemed right to Mason in a way he didn't overanalyze. Not backward, not return, just forward. Different park. Same people. Sophie climbed everything climbable, as was her policy. Avery sat on the bench next to Mason and leaned her shoulder against his, and they watched Sophie make her way up the rope ladder with the athletic focus of someone who understood that heights were not obstacles, but destinations. "She's going to be terrifying when she's older," Avery said. "She's terrifying now. She's going to be terrifying in new ways." She was quiet for a moment. "She's going to come home from school and tell us things, and we're going to have a position. We'll figure out the position. What if we don't agree on the position? We'll do what we always do," Mason said. "You'll be right about 60% of it, and I'll be right about the other 40, and we'll fight briefly and then arrive somewhere better than either of us started." She turned to look at him. "That's an unusually generous breakdown from you." "I'm feeling generous. We just had a good morning." She laughed and put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and Sophie reached the top of the climbing structure and looked down and waved with her whole arm. They both waved back. Mason had spent years believing that the thing he was best at was endurance, surviving, holding a position when everything around it was collapsing. That was what the military had developed in him, and what single parenthood had further refined. The capacity to keep going past the point where keeping going felt possible. He thought of that as strength. He still thought it was, partly. But sitting in that park on a Thursday afternoon in March, watching his daughter at the top of the climbing structure deciding which direction to conquer next. With Avery's weight warm against his shoulder and Bun Bun in the bag at his feet and a court document in the folder in the car that said what he already knew, sitting there, he understood something he hadn't fully understood before. Endurance isn't the same as living. You can endure for years without ever arriving anywhere. He'd been enduring since Afghanistan, since the accident, since every 3 a.m., since Sophie's first night home, when he'd stood over her crib, terrified of the specific fragility of something he loved that much. He'd built his whole life on the scaffolding of continuing to function. What Avery had done, what Sophie had started with a bottle of bubbles and one word in a parking lot, was something different, not louder or more dramatic than endurance. In many ways quieter. It was the difference between holding a position and deciding the position was worth holding because of what was inside it. He hadn't let himself want anything in 2 years. Not really. He'd managed, provided, protected, but wanting. The kind that made you vulnerable, the kind that could actually be taken from you. He'd locked that down so tightly he'd nearly lost the key. He hadn't known he was doing it. That was the part he kept returning to. He'd thought he was being careful. He thought he was being a good father, a responsible person, someone who'd learned from loss and applied the lesson. What he'd actually been was sealed, airtight, safe in the way that nothing that's airtight can also breathe. Sophie had picked a woman off a park bench and called her mommy. A 3-year-old's undefended instinct, aimed with perfect accuracy at the one thing he'd been trying to protect himself from needing. He thought about that often. He thought about what it cost nothing to give and what it cost everything to withhold, and how children know the difference long before the adults do. Sophie hadn't known she was doing anything important. She'd just done what felt true. Maybe that was the whole lesson. Do what feels true before you've had enough time to talk yourself out of it. Open the door before you've finished deciding whether you're ready for whoever might walk through. He hadn't been ready. He'd been far from ready. He'd changed his shirt twice and driven to a park and been thoroughly and completely unprepared for every single thing that followed. It had been the best decision he'd ever not quite made. Sophie came down from the climbing structure eventually, flushed and satisfied, and climbed onto the bench between them and immediately claimed half of Mason's water bottle and half of Avery's granola bar with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that the resources of the family unit were collective. "Can we get ice cream?" she said. Not a question. "It's 52 degrees, Mason said. "I know," Sophie said patiently. He looked at Avery over Sophie's head. Avery looked back at him with the expression she got when she was being neutral, but actually had an opinion. "Fine," he said. Sophie absorbed this victory with the composure of someone who had never doubted it. They walked to the ice cream place 2 blocks from the park, the one Sophie called the good one because it had the sprinkles she preferred, which were the large round ones and not the small thin ones, a distinction she maintained vigorously. The afternoon was cold and bright, and the park was still visible from the sidewalk, the rope structure with its empty top where Sophie had stood and waved. Sophie held both their hands walking. She did this reflexively now, naturally, the 4-handed walk they'd been doing since the zoo parking lot when she'd commanded it, and they'd complied. It wasn't a thing they'd planned. It was just a thing that was. At the ice cream counter, she deliberated at length, which was her right, and settled on a choice Mason could have predicted from the door. Avery got something small with coffee in it because she was fundamentally incapable of not ordering coffee. Mason got a scoop of something he didn't particularly want because it turned out that having ice cream on a 52-degree day in March required solidarity. They sat at the table by the window. Sophie ate her ice cream with the focused pleasure of someone who had earned it through a rigorous morning of legal proceedings and athletic achievement. Avery ate hers slowly and watched Sophie and had the expression she sometimes got that she didn't know he could read, the one that meant she was filing something away, keeping it. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at him. "I'm thinking this is going to be my life," she said. "Ice cream in March. Bun Bun in a bag. A child who is going to argue with me about sprinkled geometry until she leaves for college." She looked at Sophie. "And I'm thinking I'd pick it again. I'd pick all of it again from the very beginning." "The canceled date and everything," he said. "Especially that." She smiled. "You almost didn't go." "I changed my shirt twice." "I know, Daniel told me." "Of course he did." "You wore the gray t-shirt," she said. "I remember." He looked at her.
You remember the shirt. I remember everything about that afternoon. She said it simply, without elaboration, in the way of someone for whom this was just a fact and not a declaration. That was the afternoon I started paying attention to you. Sophie looked up from her ice cream. I knew first, she said. They both looked at her. I knew in the park, she said. I knew she was ours. She said it with the simple certainty of a 4-year-old who had never understood why things that were obvious needed to be processed slowly by adults. Mason looked at Avery. Avery looked at Mason.
What passed between them wasn't a word or even quite an expression, more like a mutual acknowledgement that they were sitting in the best version of their lives, and they both knew it, not in the abstract, but right now, in a cold ice cream shop in March, with a child's hat slightly sideways and sprinkles on the table and a court document in a folder in the car. You knew first, Mason told Sophie. I know, she said, satisfied. She ate another bite of ice cream. You're welcome. Outside, the afternoon light was already starting its long descent, the gold going amber, the shadows stretching out across the sidewalk. The park was still there, 2 blocks away, its rope structure against the pale sky. 1 year ago, they hadn't been a family. They hadn't known to look for each other. A babysitter had canceled, and a woman had said bring her, and a little girl had packed Bun Bun in her fox backpack and worn her yellow rain boots because they were happy. And the whole shape of 3 lives had turned on those small, unheroic choices, the ones that don't feel like decisions until much later when you can see what they opened. That was the thing about love, Mason thought. Not the thunderclap version, not the kind that announces itself in the middle of a meaningful moment and waits to be recognized. The kind that builds in proximity, in popsicles delivered on a Saturday morning, in being told when you've canceled something important, in sitting at a kitchen table at 2 a.m. without being asked to explain yourself. The kind that doesn't transform you. The kind that finds you as you already are, broken in some places, reinforced in others, still learning, and says, this is enough. You're enough right now as you are. He had survived a war. He had survived loss. He had survived the particular terror of loving a child when you're not sure you're capable of being what she needs. He had not survived Avery Sinclair, not in the way of enduring her, not in the way of outlasting anything. He had simply run out of reasons to keep her at a distance, and she had shown up anyway, with popsicles and a French press and a plumb line she'd waited a respectful interval to deploy, and here they were. Here they were. Sophie finished her ice cream and pushed the cup aside and said, Can we go home? Yeah, Bug, Mason said. We can go home. And they did. And it was without qualification exactly